Hello,
The city
horror
felt
fans.
different that
Today
night,
I will tell
like
you a
the air
scary
itself
story
was
that will
heavier,
shock you.
thicker.
I warn you, children.
It wasn't
Stay
just
away
the
from
usual
the
hum of
screams.
traffic
This
or the
story
murmur
is
of distant
full
voices.
paranormal
It was
events.
something deep. Something unsettling. I should have known then, the second I stepped out of my apartment, that it was going to be one of those nights. But I didn't. I was tired. My shift had just ended, and the only thing on my mind was getting home, slipping into bed, and letting the exhaustion swallow me whole. It started with the little things. A shadow flitting across the alleyway, barely a glimpse, but enough to make the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself it was nothing. The city was full of shadows, after all. But then I heard it. A soft rustling, like footsteps, quick and deliberate, just behind me. I froze, the sound stopped too, like the person, if it was a person, had noticed that I'd heard them. The streetlights flickered, casting long, sickly pools of light onto the cracked pavement. I couldn't see anyone, not really, but the feeling of being watched, of being hunted, settled deep into my bones. I picked up my pace, my heart hammering in my chest. The footsteps followed suit, quickening as I did. It wasn't a coincidence. I turned a corner, hoping to lose whoever was behind me in the labyrinth of side streets, but when I glanced back, I caught a glimpse of him. He was there, not in the way you might expect. No sudden movement, no sprinting toward me like in the movies. Just there. Standing in the dark, leaning against a brick wall, watching me. His eyes reflected the streetlights like pools of black ink. His face was hidden in shadow, but the silhouette was unmistakable, a tall man, thin, too thin. And he was smiling. A smile I could feel in my gut, a twisted grin that didn't belong in the world of the living. I didn't stop to think. My breath came in ragged gasps as I sprinted down the street, hearing nothing but the pounding of my feet and the deafening rush of blood in my ears. I didn't know where I was going. All I knew was that I needed to get away from him, away from that smile, that predatory gaze, but no matter how fast I ran, the sound of his footsteps matched mine, echoing in the dark like a twisted game of cat and mouse. I made a desperate turn, hoping to lose him in the maze of buildings, but when I glanced behind me again, he was closer. Much closer. I screamed, but it wasn't enough to break the suffocating silence of the night. He was too fast, too silent, closing the distance between us with every step, and then, in the blink of an eye, he was there, his hand shot out from the shadows, grabbing my arm with a vice-like grip. I swung around, ready to fight, but he was too strong, too quick. He shoved me against the wall with a force that left me breathless, the cold brick biting into my back. I was dizzy, disoriented, but I could see his face now, pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare straight through me. He didn't speak at first. Just stood there, watching me struggle, his smile stretching wider, impossibly wide. "I know who you are," he finally said, his voice a soft rasp that made my skin crawl. The words barely registered at first, but then they sank in. He knew me. He knew everything about me. I didn't know how, or why, but the feeling of being caught, of being cornered by someone who knew everything about me, was worse than anything I'd ever felt in my life. "You're not getting away," he whispered, and then, with a sudden movement, he shoved something cold and sharp against my neck. I could feel the pressure building, the blade pressing deeper, and I knew, without a doubt, that if I made a wrong move, I wouldn't get out of this alive. His grin widened again, a grotesque, maniacal smile, as he leaned in closer. "You don't even know who I am, do you?" he whispered, his breath hot against my skin. I didn't answer. I couldn't, because the truth was, I didn't, but I was about to find out. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, as his cold breath scraped across my skin. The blade pressed harder against my throat, a cruel reminder that any moment, it could end. The thing is, I didn't know who he was. Not then, not at that moment, but I knew that this wasn't random. This man, this monster, he wasn't some passerby, some deranged stranger. No, he had a purpose. He had a plan. And somehow, I had found myself at the center of it. "You look confused," he murmured, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. "Don't worry. You'll remember soon enough." His words made no sense, and yet, they cut through me like a physical wound, bleeding panic into my veins. The longer he spoke, the more I felt as though something inside me was unlocking, like memories I had buried deep down were beginning to resurface, shifting, clawing at the walls of my mind, desperate to get out. But I wasn't ready, not yet. You've heard the stories, haven't you? He asked, his tone almost playful, like we were having a casual conversation in the midst of a nightmare. My heart pounded so loud I was sure he could hear it. My mouth felt dry, too dry to speak, but somehow, I managed to whisper, "What stories?" He chuckled, low and dark, sending a ripple of dread down my spine. The ones about the people who disappeared. The ones who never came back. A chill ran down my back. I remembered now. The stories. The rumors. How could I have forgotten? They were all over the news: disappearances, strange murders, bodies found in abandoned houses. The city had been paralyzed with fear for months. People were scared to go out at night, but those stories always felt like someone else's problem. They were just whispers in the wind, something you heard at work, or in passing on the street, and then forgot about. I had never thought it would reach me, but here I was. Do you know what they all had in common? He asked, his voice now dangerously soft. I swallowed hard, but my throat felt like it was closing up. They were all close to you, he said, his words so quiet I could barely hear them, yet they seemed to echo in my skull like the tolling of a bell. They were all people you knew. Friends, family, acquaintances. People you saw every day. People you trusted. I could barely keep up with his words as they slowly unfurled into something darker, something more twisted than I had prepared for. I had known some of those people. I had been friends with some of them. My stomach twisted into knots. No. I whispered, but it was too late. I knew what he was getting at. Yes, he breathed, his voice a haunting whisper in the dark. You knew them. And now you're part of it. Suddenly, the pressure on my neck lessened, just enough for me to take a shuddering breath. He let me breathe, but his eyes never left mine. Those black, empty eyes. You've been watching the news, he continued, his grin returning, like he was enjoying every moment of my unraveling. You've seen the pattern. The faces. The places. You've seen how they all disappear without a trace. And you've seen how it's always the same. After they vanish, no one ever talks about them again. It's like they were never here. Like they were erased. The blade slid down slightly, grazing my skin, and I felt a rush of heat pulse through me. My head spun, and the pain in my chest intensified as the realization hit me. He wasn't just a random killer. He wasn't just terrorizing the city. He was taking something, someone. And I was next. No, I gasped, shaking my head, trying to push the fog away, to make sense of it all. Why? Why me? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he just smiled, his teeth flashing in the dark like something feral, something predatory. The answer lingered in the air between us, unspoken, but undeniable. Because you're special, he finally whispered. You're part of the plan. I didn't understand. I couldn't. I had been going about my life, like any other person, not realizing that I was being watched. Not realizing I had become a part of something much larger, much darker than I could ever have imagined, and then it clicked, one piece of the puzzle falling into place. I remembered something from years ago. Something buried deep in the corners of my mind, something I had tried to forget: the deaths. The disappearances. They weren't random. They were deliberate. I had known someone who had disappeared. I just hadn't put the pieces together until now. His grip on my arm tightened, pulling me from my thoughts, and I was snapped back to the present. You should have stayed away, he said, his voice now full of disdain, like I had done something unforgivable. But you didn't. And now, well, now it's your turn. I barely had time to react before he shoved me forward, into the alley, into the shadows that seemed to swallow everything whole. The walls around us closed in, a maze of twisted streets and darkness that pressed against me, as if the city itself was complicit in this nightmare. I could feel the panic rising again, bubbling in my chest, threatening to spill over. My mind raced, but it was a blur of fragmented thoughts, memories, and fears. I had to escape. I had to survive, but no matter how hard I tried to run, no matter how fast I pushed myself, the shadows were always there, watching, following. And he was always a step behind me, like the specter of death, always just out of reach, but what I didn't know then was that he wasn't after me alone. He was after something much bigger. I couldn't outrun him. That much became painfully clear within minutes. The streets stretched on forever, twisting and turning in ways I didn't remember, like the city itself was alive and toying with me, shifting its shape to trap me. But no matter how hard I pushed, how fast I ran, there was always the sound of footsteps behind me. Always that unsettling presence, just at the edge of my awareness. I had to get away. My chest burned with each breath, my legs aching with the strain of running on adrenaline, but I couldn't stop. Not yet. Not when I could still hear the man's voice echoing in my head, his words poisoning my thoughts. You're part of the plan. What did that mean? Part of the plan. That thought gnawed at me, gnawed at every corner of my mind. My head felt light, like I was spiraling, falling into something much larger than myself, something beyond my control. Suddenly, a sharp pain erupted in my side. I gasped, stumbling forward. I reached instinctively to clutch my ribs, feeling the wetness that seeped through my fingers. Blood. I had been cut. I didn't dare look behind me, but I could feel him, could feel his eyes on me, like a predator watching its prey. My pulse raced, and I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, drowning out the sounds of the night. Then, without warning, a voice broke through the air, sharp and clear in the darkness. Stop running. I froze. The voice was like a command, and without thinking, I obeyed. I wasn't sure if I had any choice. My body felt like it was moving on its own, pulled by some invisible force. He stepped into the dim light, just enough so I could see him now, fully. His gaunt figure, his hollow eyes, his crooked smile. But there was something different about him now. Something darker. He wasn't just the monster in the shadows anymore. He was someone I had known. The realization hit me like a slap in the face, and my stomach turned. I stumbled back, my hands shaking. What are you doing here? I stammered. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he tilted his head, as though savoring the moment. The smile didn't leave his face, but something else flickered in his eyes. Something that almost looked familiar. You really don't remember, do you? He asked, almost disappointed. I shook my head, the blood roaring in my ears. My pulse thudded in my chest, cold sweat trickling down my back. I could barely think straight. No, I whispered, barely able to form the words. Who are you? He took a slow step toward me, his eyes never leaving mine. My instinct screamed at me to run, to get away from him before it was too late, but my legs felt like lead. I couldn't move. You don't recognize me? He asked again, this time the question almost laced with something resembling pity. My throat went dry. I searched his face, his features, but nothing clicked. There was something wrong about the way he looked, about how he stood before me like a specter, and then it hit me. A memory. A faint flash of a face from the past, someone I had known a lifetime ago. Someone I had trusted. I know you, I whispered, the truth dawning on me like a painful revelation. You're Mark. The man, the monster, smiled wider, a twisted grin that made my skin crawl. Finally, he said softly, almost to himself. Took you long enough. Mark. The name burned in my mind, dragging up fragments of memories I'd buried for years. We had been friends once. Best friends, even. But that was before everything changed. Before Mark disappeared. It was then that the pieces clicked together, the terrible truth unfolding before me like a nightmare that had been hiding in plain sight. Mark hadn't just disappeared. He had become something else. Something monstrous. And I had been the reason for it. I had watched it happen. I had seen him slip away, slip into the shadows, slip into the role of a predator, a killer. I had ignored it, told myself it was just a phase, just something he was going through. But I had been wrong. Mark had never truly disappeared. He had just changed. You're part of it now, he whispered, taking another step closer. You've always been part of it. I took a shaky step back, my mind reeling, my heart pounding. The memories, the truth, were all coming at me like a tidal wave, drowning me, suffocating me. I wanted to scream, but my voice caught in my throat, but he didn't give me the chance to react. In a blur of movement, Mark lunged forward, faster than I could anticipate. His hand shot out, grabbing me by the wrist and twisting my arm behind my back, pulling me toward him. I gasped, struggling, but his grip was iron. "Please," I begged, my voice trembling. "Why are you doing this?" Mark's face softened for a moment, just a flicker of something human crossing his expression. But then it was gone, replaced by that same cold smile. "I'm doing this because I need you to understand," he said, his voice dark and calm. "You're the last piece. You're the key. And when this is over, when I've taken everything, I'll leave you here. In the dark. Just like all the others." My breath caught in my chest, my heart skipping a beat. "No. Please, you don't have to," he didn't let me finish. With a sickening twist of his hand, he shoved me into the darkness, into the shadows that swallowed everything whole. I fell, crumpling against the cold concrete, the world spinning around me. I could hear him, his footsteps retreating into the night. The sound of his laughter echoed in my ears, a haunting melody that lingered long after he was gone. The last thing I heard before the darkness consumed me was the sound of his voice, fading into the distance. "You'll never be alone again."